personal life. I've heard about these things. I think they sound very nice. And so we do Wednesday at noon so that I can go through, check all your scores by the end of the day Wednesday, so I can get in touch with you and everything else like that. All of that is to say, I will also tell you up front, anywhere. And if you want, this is okay. Yeah. If you email me after 5 or if you email me on the weekends, unless your email is like my hair's on fire, oh sweet Jesus, I'll probably get back to you the next day, okay? So just as a heads up and to kind of set expectations. So you guys have all been really good about that, just wanting to say that. So today for class, what we're gonna do is we're gonna do our first section will be greatest hits of botany, right? So we're gonna cover, woohoo! You guys all did great on your quizzes, so I know this is gonna be that, a little bit of review, but also new information. Then we'll take our break. For the second half, we'll do activities so that we can kind of test what we're learning and make sure it's actually making sense. And then after that, we'll do a little bit of talk about the final project in case we kind of have information we want to share about that. And, oh, the only other thing I really want you guys to take home from today, and take home from the entire class, and I will say this again and again and again, and it's very, very, very important. You do not have to remember everything you read. You do not have to remember everything even that I say. Please, it's okay, right? We're learning. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to introduce you to a bunch of material so that when you get asked questions, or even when you have your own questions about what's going on in your garden or your yard, you can say like, oh, I think I've heard that before. Oh, I think that exists, right? Let me go look it up. Let me go consult a reference and find out more, right? We are trying to build a big scaffold that you can hang information on. It is very, very hard. We've all taken math classes where we realized they were hanging information on the scaffold as they were building it, right? And it's hard because we do not know what just happened. All we're trying to do here is build the scaffold, okay? So remember what you can. Don't worry about the rest. Just remember that maybe you heard it someday and you can look it up, right? Our ultimate answer in life is not the right answer. Our ultimate answer is, I don't know, let me look it up and get back to you. Yeah, that is our answer, right? One thing I learned in grad school, if you give the wrong made-up answer and it's clearly made up, that is a world of hurt worse than I don't know, let me look it up, okay? So I don't know, let me look it up, people. All right, if you get really interested in botany, this is a fun book. It's not for everyone, but it is a cool way to get into botany. Botany is not the same as horticulture, right? Botany is what are all the names, what are things derived from, how did things grow? It is a namesy, wordy type of people. Horticulture is how we grow plants, right? I think of these things as being complementary, but you don't have to typically remember all the crazy botanical terms just to know how to grow it, right? Those are different sides of the same coin. All right, so let's dive in, right? Okay. This is from an evolutionary biologist perspective. So the other thing I want to give as a caveat to this talk is that I will sometimes talk about evolution as if like it was marching in a direction or something happened that we expected to happen. Evolution is what happens when you give a bunch of organisms hundreds of millions of years. Some do slightly better than others. The reasons they do better can be passed on, and then all of a sudden you have a cat, right? So from like a cell, you build a cat, right? And that's crazy, and it's not directed, but we're humans, so we like storytelling, so forgive me for using directed language. So plants are really, really different than animals. This is the most important thing if you're gonna think about plants. What do I mean by that? So this is a way of viewing kind of evolution where we have bacteria and archaea and protists, right? All these single-celled guys. And then from one end comes animals, and from a different group comes plants. What does that mean? That means that plants are an independent evolution of multicellularity. So they put their cells together, they join their cells together differently. Their structures are different. A lot of things we do, they do not do because they have figured out a different way of building a multicellular organism. Right? That's why they seem so different to us. Fun sidebar, yes, mushrooms are closer to animals than plants. We think of them like plants, but they're not. And so a lot of what we'll see kind of going through this is kind of it's a result of plants being so different. One of the major differences you'll see in plants that, especially if you come from kind of a medical background, will be very interesting to you. Plant cells do not move, okay? So when I started school, I took an entire class on cell movement. By the end of it, I was like, none of this matters. I don't know why this is a required course. So the way animals, the way we heal our bodies is oftentimes we move cells. We move things around, we rebuild things, we're able to put things into like spaces between other things. A plant adds cells, and like if this is a cell, and then it adds another one, nothing can go here, and it cannot heal it by moving cells there. And that just matters because a lot of times plants can't heal the way we do. They can seal off wounds, but they can't heal wounds truly the same way we can. Okay, so the way we're going to structure this talk is, gotta keep my hair away from the mic, okay, is we're going to go through a little bit of taxonomy and relationships, and we're going to intersperse that with anatomy, because we're going to march through this in kind of an evolutionary progression. And then towards the end, we're going to touch on physiology, right, which is really, really important, especially given our wonderful climate. Okay, so in the beginning, right, imagine time like this, or you can also imagine time is going this way, and we're going to show relationships. We're going to build this up. So in the beginning, you have something like a green algae. We currently have plants a lot like this. They're called charophytes. It's like single-celled algae, right? They can photosynthesize, they can do their little thing, they're out in the water, living their best lives. After a while, they figure out how to not have to be strictly in the water, but how to protect their baby plants, their embryos. And that gives rise to bryophytes. And we'll talk more about each of these groups, don't worry. Bryophytes are things like mosses, liverworts, right? These things that seem kind of ancient to us. Bryophytes can only get so tall because they don't have a vascular system, right? Our vascular system is like our veins. So they build up their vascular system, that develops, and all of a sudden you get the vascular non-seeded plants, right? So things like equisetum, a lot of our ferns, which have spores, not seeds, right? These things that if you were going to draw like a child's dinosaur diagram, right? You would draw like a bunch of ferns, right? What we think of as these sort of ancient jungly plants. And that's because they still need water a fair bit because of how they reproduce, and so they tend to be in wetter environments. Finally, plants figure out how to really enclose their embryos, really truly protect them in seeds. From that you get the gymnosperms, right? So the needle plants, right? Pines, conifers, ginkgo even. Ginkgo is a very ancient plant in this group. And finally, flowers and fruit, you get the angiosperms. These guys are now something like 90% of our plants. They're most of what we cultivate. It is things with pretty flowers, things with fruits, things we eat, grasses, all of these things, right? All of this is to say, an angiosperm is no better than a caryophyte, right? Like, or charophyte. Like, he's no further along, nothing like that. They're all evolving at the same time, but there are more features, right? Okay. So starting with the non-vascular plants, mosses and liverworts. These guys are really, really cool and oftentimes have really interesting growth structures because they're just unlike what we're used to seeing. There's a really phenomenal moss garden over at Duke Gardens that one of our master gardeners, Flora O'Brien, helps maintain, and she's put in a small moss garden out here for us too. These guys are cool, right? Liverworts, that is a weird growth form. To the point where in a garden it can actually be really, really striking because it's not something we see normally, although it requires a lot of moisture so they can be hard to grow around here unless you have a wet area. Like I said, a lot of times these plants will be described as primitive. I don't like that term myself, but it's something you will hear. I don't like that term because we've all been evolving the exact same amount of time because we're all here, right? We're all at this point in time, so it's fine. And I think that's a little bit dismissive, given that just because a moss figured out what it was doing so long ago, it didn't have to change it. You know, we want to say it's primitive. The vascular non-seed-bearing plants, these are really, really cool ones. Ferns, club mosses, horsetails, they have spores instead of seeds. This is really important to note too. It is not uncommon that you will get a question that is like, oh my god, what is this thing on my fern? It's the underside of the leaf, neatly arranged little brown circles. Those are sporangia. Those are the spore-producing structures of the fern. That's just what the fern's doing, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a problem. These can also be really striking. There are some evergreen ferns, which is nice because these can be great in the garden. So the main thing that ferns had, right, that the ones before before them, the bryophytes didn't have, was this vascular tissue. And so what do we really mean when we say vascular tissue? Right, so we have the xylem, which transports water and nutrients from roots to leaves. I think of the xylem as mostly moving up, right, from roots to leaves, water and other nutrients. In contrast to the phloem, which transports sugars and other things produced by photosynthesis down. Both of these can travel in different directions depending on the season and depending on how transport needs to work, right? So for example, in the spring, when a lot of plants are putting out new leaves, sugars and everything need to travel up from the roots where they were stored, whereas in the fall, when the plant is shutting down, those things will travel down to the roots for storage. But what this really allows you to do is it allows the plants to get bigger. You're good. You're totally good. Don't even worry about it. It allows the plants to get bigger, grow taller, and have more specialized structures. Okay. And so that's really, really important because where a bryophyte could get this big, now we have trees, right? And that's because of vascular tissue. Through that vascular tissue, another major important thing is that the plants have their own hormones to communicate. Because plants figured out multicellularity in a different way than we did, their hormones are different than ours, because that's what hormones really are, right? They're the signals you send in a body to communicate what in the world is going on, right? Like you need your heart and your feet to kind of be relatively aware of each other and what's going on, and so that's what hormones do. So going through these really quickly, some of the major plant hormones, we have auxins, which are involved in tropisms. A tropism is a growth direction. Phototropism, growing toward the light. Gravitropism, growing against gravity, right? Auxins help regulate that. Also apical dominance, which we'll come back to later, which is the idea that typically whatever's growing at the top actually suppresses growth on the sides. Gibberellins help break seed and bud dormancy and promote growth. Cytokinins promote cell division and prevent senescence. Again, remember, I'm just trying to get you guys to remember that plants have hormones. Okay, don't stress too much. Ethylene, this is the one we know, right? Why you might put a banana in with other fruit you're trying to get to ripen. Ethylene's a really interesting hormone because it's a gas. And it's a way that plants can sense each other and communicate with each other. So that's the other thing a lot of us are not aware of is that a lot of plants can sense the hormones from other plants around them and will respond. So if a plant near them is stressed, they can pick up those stress signals and they might start beefing up their own defense, even before they get hit.
Ashley?
Yeah.
What's senescence? Remind me.
Oh yeah, of course. Senescence, death, right? Or kind of dying.
Oh, okay.
Right, so it helps keep
prevent the dying of the plant.
Yes, so it helps it keep going, helps it keep growing. Which is it's a great question because if you look at this, right, abscisic acid, the last one helps close stomata, it maintains dormancy. So some of these are stop signals, right? Maintaining dormancy. Abscission is when a leaf typically falls off. It's how that layer is cut between the plant and the leaf, right, like in the fall. So some of these are more like stop, and some of these are more like go. But both of them can typically do, or all of them can typically do both. And one of the interesting things is the reason I have this picture here is this is a plant, a willow oak that was hit with a plant hormone that they didn't mean to hit it with, right? And what do we mean by a plant hormone? I mean a pesticide, right? So most of our pesticides that we use on plants are things that are actually plant hormones that we figured out how to use against them, right? So if auxin helps kind of handle apical dominance, if I hit this with really weird auxin at the wrong time, all of a sudden it just starts doing that, right? And you can kind of kill a plant by telling it to grow way too fast to the point where it exhausts itself. Once you have a vascular system and you have hormones, you can get much more detailed and involved roots because you all of a sudden have a bigger plant you have to support. Root functions, some of the major ones are anchorage, absorbing water and minerals, storing food and supporting the stem. We think of roots like this a lot of the time, but actually the most important roots typically for any plant are the extremely fine roots that we can barely even see. These big, meaty roots are for anchorage, whereas all the fine roots, you know, like when you, especially when you dig up something like a tomato or something like that and it pulls up all that soil with it, and it's big, those are the fine roots that are actually absorbing nutrients, whereas the bigger roots are the ones that are helping to anchor the plant. The way that roots grow is very similar to the way that shoots grow. And they grow by adding cells just at the very tip. Remember, plant cells don't move, so if you want to add cells, you have to basically be adding them always at the tip. These are sections called meristems, these areas of active growth. Meristem sounds a lot like stem cell, right? That stem word. These are areas at the tip of every root and at the tip of every shoot, and in some other places on the plant, where they have populations of stem cells that they can make a whole new plant from. Right? So a lot of plant biologists, if they're trying to clone plants, what they do is, if you or I to clone a plant, we'd cut it in half and we'd have two and we'd be like, it's cloned. Done. A plant biologist, if they want to do that, but they want to do it sterilely, right? You can take these cells, put them on an agar dish, right, like a scientist's petri dish, add a bunch of hormones in the right sequence, and it will turn into that plant, right? You can get all these cells to differentiate. So these are little stem cell populations, which is pretty cool. Those fibrous roots that we talked about as being so important are really, really important as well, because they also are what form relationships with the mycorrhizae in the soil, right? So the fungal populations in the soil. And so plant roots can only extend so far. So to reach even further, they make these partnerships with fungus. And what they do is that the fungus gives them oftentimes a lot of things like water and minerals and extending the reach, nutrients that they might not be able to get otherwise. And in return, the plant gives them sugars, right? So they're feeding each other, helping each other out. And what that means is, like, for example, this little tiny pine sapling, his root system ends right about here. All the rest of that is mycorrhizal relationships. The fungus that go out so much further allows him to reach so much further and get so much more of what he needs. These fungal relationships in the soil can connect up, which is really cool. And this is one way that we think that there's a lot of plant-plant signaling, is because they have linked fungal relationships underground, and so they can kind of tell what other plants are doing and how they're, especially things like stress, right? It is way better to find out that locusts are coming by realizing that your neighbor has been bitten by locusts than to wait until you are, right? So this is a lot of what's going on. Once you have roots and a vascular system, you can have longer, stronger stems. These are mostly for structural support and for transport, right? So the phloem and the xylem are in those stems. One kind of fun thing is that because evolution is awesome, and it will always figure out how to turn one thing into another thing, is that, oh, I got ahead of myself, I was too excited. We'll get there. I always want that sort of transition. I'm like, then we just talk about evolution. Anyway, so stems have nodes. These are that meristematic tissue, right? So here, for example, this is a little node, this is a node, this is a node. Anytime you see a plant, a leaf attach, that's a node. And typically right where the leaf attaches to the stem, right here, there's a little bunch of that meristematic tissue, which is why a lot of times when you cut a plant, not all plants, but if you have a plant that's growing up and you cut the top, what happens? Pushes out, right? That's what we're talking about with apical dominance. What happened was that top bud that you cut off was using auxin, a plant hormone, to suppress growth of all those little side buds. And when you cut it off, that suppression was no longer there, and then everybody was like, I'm going to become the new top, right? And so they all kind of explode out, you get a big bushy plant, and they're all kind of trying to reach to the top to become the new leader, right?
Was that, well, I'm getting maybe ahead of you. I was thinking about monocot and diacot, and if you cut the top of something and it's diacot, the rings that won't grow anymore.
Right, so monocots oftentimes, things like lilies, grasses, whatever, right? Their stems are at the bottom, their meristems are at the bottom,
Right.
and so that's why you can't bush them out the same way, whereas a lot of the other ones will, but we'll get there.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. So, when you're pruning, make sure you always cut just above a node, because otherwise you're going to have a long dead stick right down to where the node is. The node is what will grow back out. It's a more attractive way to prune, to just prune right above the node, and it's a little bit healthier for the plant. You always, if you were taking cuttings though to make a new plant, you want that node, right? So for cuttings for a new plant, you would cut right here, and then you might trim this extra bit off just to make the remaining plant look better. But the node is really what's going to give you all that extra growth. Internode is really just the space between the nodes. Internode internodes can get long when they don't have enough light, right? Or if you accidentally hit them with an herbicide that causes long internode growth, sometimes we see that too. This is the one I wanted to talk about. Okay, so modified stems, we have two major types. We have stolons and rhizomes. Stolons are above ground runners, like what you would see in strawberries. Rhizomes are basically just at the ground level or right below. I don't think it matters that you can distinguish between these two, but for the people keeping track at home, I think of a stolon like a stem and a rhizome like a root, right? So even though they're both modified stems, stolon is above the ground, rhizome, like a root, is right at or below the ground, right? You can also have bulbs, tubers, and corms. These are energy storage, right? So a daffodil bulb, a potato, right? All of these things are actually highly modified stem structures where they have figured out how to store all of that energy in that stem as opposed to storing it in the roots. All right, leaves, food production, right? This is another thing that actually the leaves in most of the vascular plants are significantly different than the bryophytes, right? You start getting these big, lush leaves, right? You never see a leaf like that on a moss, right? They absorb sunlight and produce energy. We'll talk a little bit more about how they do that in the physiology portion of the talk. Importantly, only green tissue contains chlorophyll, and it's able to photosynthesize. What does that mean? It means these beautiful plants we buy like this that have all the white on them, that white tissue cannot photosynthesize. It's a drag on the plant, actually. These plants tend to grow slower. Also, oftentimes you will see shoots that come up that do not have the white. They'll revert. Because the plant doesn't want that. Not really. So the thing to do then is to clip that back out, clip out any reverted tissue, any old green tissue to force it to keep doing what it's doing. But just know that these guys you have to baby a little bit more, right? Because it's like they're working at 80 or 90% capacity, right? Outside of the leaf, you have the cuticle. This is a really important edge. It's like our skin, right? This is the margin that kind of protects everything inside and everything that's going on. It's composed of a waxy substance, far waxier in some plants than others, right? So the really thickened cuticle like a cactus. Repels water, protects from dehydration, protects from disease. It's really important. It does get thicker with sunlight, right? So the cuticle will get thicker. It's like their own little SPF, right? And it's usually thicker on evergreens, which makes sense, right? If you think about a needle, like a pine needle, that's really thick. Or if you think about even something like this, might be a camellia, that's really thick as well. Okay, so far we have vascular systems, we have roots, we have stems, we have leaves, all really, really good stuff. But remember, we're about to have some really cool innovations, right? Because now we're marching into the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. These are the things that we tend to really like in our gardens. So we've got seeds now. So gymnosperms. You're going to have conifers, cycads, and ginkgo. A few of them are deciduous. So things like bald cypress and ginkgo, they lose their leaves, right? Also, just because these things are evergreen does not mean that they don't ever lose their needles. A lot of evergreens actually push their needles out in the spring when the new needles come on. So a lot of times you'll get evergreen browning in the spring, or you'll get evergreen needle drop in the spring, but it's just because they're pushing out their new ones. Every year we get calls though, right? What is going on? And you're like, it's fine, just give it a minute, let it push through what it's doing, right? So here's a question. So the thing about the angiosperms is that they have flowers and fruit. But in the gymnosperms, you might see things like ginkgo fruit, juniper berries. Are these fruit? No, right? Gymnosperms don't have fruit. This is a modified cone that never got hard. Okay? This is actually just derived from entirely different tissue, right? So a lot of times you'll see things, and this is what a botanist would care about, right? A botanist would be like, I don't care if you call it a juniper berry, it's not a berry. That's like some sort of sickness that you guys have. I know it's not a berry, right? So just be aware that on the gymnosperms, on the needle plants, even if you see something that looks like a berry, it's not a berry, right? It is actually actually more like a cone, which is just an interesting fact and will make you more fun at parties.
So it's not, sorry, it's not a berry because it's not a fruit.
Yeah, because it's a gymnosperm. It just can't have a fruit.
Yeah.
It's just like definitional, you know?
So what do we call it?
I'd call it a juniper berry because like nobody actually does want that person at a party.
So gymnosperms don't get pollinated. There's no fruit on them, or do
They do get pollinated. They get wind pollinated. Yeah, so gymnosperms all get wind pollinated. And so grasses get wind pollinated too, but gymnosperms kind of definitionally get wind pollinated. They form these cones, whether it's a cone like this or a cone like this, right? And some of these might be to help animals pass them along, but a lot of times it's still just spread in other ways. Junipers can have really, really different types of leaves. They can have scales, needles, sort of this awl shape that you see on juniper, right? But these are still leaves. They're really highly derived leaves. All right, once you get into angiosperms, now we have fruit, right? We have a lot of fruit that's misnamed, right? Like a strawberry is a drupe. Actually, it's not a berry, but it's a fruit, right? It counts. And the angiosperms can be divided into two major groups, the monocots and the dicots. And these names come from the number of cotyledon, or seed leaves, that these plants have. So the seed leaves are the first little leaves that come out of the seed that were basically packed with that baby plant. And they don't look like the normal leaves of the plant. They just look like these special little structures that are just there to basically give it a little jump start before it can start producing its own proper leaves, true leaves. So a monocot comes out with one seed leaf, and a dicot comes out with two seed leaves. Monocots are things like grasses, lilies, orchids, and palms, and there are no true trees that are monocots. Palm tree, again, what does a botanist like? A botanist likes splitting hairs. Palm tree is not a true tree, right? Because they actually have a hard time getting significantly wider the way an oak would. And it's because of how these things grow. Dicot will be things like beans, marigolds, most plants, truly. It's most of what we interact with are dicots. Once you have flowers and leaves, even though a lot of other plants have buds, now you have flower buds, right? Because you have flowers. These are undeveloped shoots that are kind of in a resting state. You can tell the difference pretty easily between flowers and buds because, oh no, anyway, okay, I'll not worry about that. Flower buds tend to be a lot fatter, whereas leaf buds tend to be a lot pointier, right? If you just imagine that, if I had to fold a leaf up into a tiny little space, or I had to fold a flower up into a tiny little space, I would need more space for the flower, right? Because there's like petals and sepals and all this other stuff going on. A lot of plants can also have adventitious buds. These are spots where you have that meristem tissue in other places. So if you go through and you really just wallop that poor unsuspecting plant, a lot of times it can grow back, even if with this really bad pruning, it'll come back almost like the stem will start shooting out new plants, right? Because there were all these little spots where you had meristem tissue kind of tucked away in there that now it's like, oh my God, I gotta save us, right? And they start trying really hard. So if you see something like this, I always say, give it time. See what comes up, see how it works out. Most plant problems, I will say, try waiting a year if you have the time, just to see, right? Is it gonna come back? Is it gonna try and save itself? The major exception is that most conifers cannot do this. So for example, we used to have some conifers out front of the building. We got very enthusiastic about pruning one day, as happens. And basically, this is not one of those plants, but imagine this plant, but just with its skirt raised, right? To about right here. Opened up that stem, made it look like a kid's Christmas tree, right? We ended up taking it down because for other reasons, but also because it could never fix that. New buds were not coming, right? And so this is why we have to be kind of knowledgeable and careful when we're pruning our conifers, because if we make bad cuts, it's hard for them to fix it because they don't have those adventitious buds. They're not just gonna grow back into that space. How do buds know when to grow? The this is especially relevant for our fruit tree people, they know by chilling hours, right? So a bud knows to sit and stay dormant until it's received however many hours, however many chilling hours we call. We think of it as days between something like, I think it's 35 and 42 is really ideal, but it's these colder days, right? 32 and 45. I had it backwards, but you know, 9 degrees doesn't do better for the plant than 32, right? 32 is enough to get it there. And if you look at a map, there are actually these really cool maps out where you can see exactly how many chilling hours you need for any given region, right? So South Florida doesn't get that cold. So you want varieties there that don't need that much cold until they break their buds, right? Whereas further north, you want varieties that actually need a lot of cold, 1,200 hours. Because if we have a little plant growing up in Tennessee that thinks that it can send its buds out after 200 hours, it's just going to freeze the flowers, right? What's going to happen is it's going to hit 200 cold hours in like November. It's going to flower, and then all those buds are going to die. We all see it every year, right? That poor ornamental plum tree blooming wildly in like December, and we're just like, oh man. Good luck, bud. Just do your best. And that's because that was a plant that was developed for someplace that needed fewer chilling hours, but it was planted here, right? In our area, you typically want to be looking for 800 to 1,000 chilling hours if you're planting fruit trees. We're going to have a whole section on fruit trees, but something I will say is that big box stores and everyone else will try to sell you fruit trees, and some of them are good. Some of them, you know? I would say research what you want, think it through, order fruit trees. You can order them online. There are a number of different nurseries in the areas that sell good varieties. If you want a fruit tree, that's a long-term investment. I would just say, like, pick the right one, right? Because you're going to be living with whatever you picked for a long time. Or not, or it's just going to die. And then you're just going to be doing it again, right? The other thing, for those of you who are not fruit tree people, is that North Carolina is a highly varied state. This is just a note about picking varieties for our area, okay? So we go from the coast to Mount Mitchell, which is the highest point east of the Mississippi. And this is an interesting fact, and I'll explain it, don't worry. For every 1,000 foot elevation gain, every 1,000 feet I go from the coast up into the mountains, it's like going 200 to 300 miles north from a climate perspective. What does that mean? That means that there are plant populations around Mount Mitchell in the mountains that are more similar to Ontario, Canada than they are to us, okay? This is why I caution folks, when you go visit your friends in the mountains, they also have different soil. Or you go visit your friends on the coast, they also have different soil. Their climate's different, their soil's different. I don't care how much you love that plant, right? Research it. Research it.
Is that ratio just for North Carolina or for any region?
In general. It's a general rule. 1,000 feet in elevation is like 200 to 300 miles north, right? Because it's colder. Everything's different. And so just make sure you're really researching what you're putting into your garden. And it's like, I've just put in too many rhododendrons and I've heard about too many lilacs. It's not to say it couldn't work. There's a place over in Cary where they have some of those trees that grow out in the mountains because they have a really weird microclimate. But I'm just saying, like, be willing to say goodbye to that plant. All right, back to monocots and dicots a little bit. Monocots, and this is the major distinction, right? We're thinking about all of these things with parallel veins. We're thinking about all of these things that are not true trees. The most important distinction between monocots and dicots is actually how their vascular tissue is laid out. This is the real distinction. This is what we think of, and this is what typically will matter for any questions you're answering, but this is the deep down of it, right? So monocots have their vascular tissue just in bundles, right? Like it's just wild, it's just almost like fiber optic cable is how I think of it, right? It's not particularly well organized, it's a bunch of little cables in a big cable. I'm sure someone who actually knows about fiber optic cable would be like, that's not right, but it's fine, it's close enough. And so what that means is it's really hard for them to grow out, right? because there's no real order here, and so it's hard to kind of meaningfully march that out, and it's hard to get wider, which is why their versions of trees are pretty stickish. That's in contrast to dicots, where all that vascular tissue is really well organized into like clean bundles, where you have the xylem on the inside, right, so the water transport on the inside, the phloem or food transport on the outside. It's easy to add this out in rings. It's why you do get rings on trees when you cut them down, is it's actually those layers marching out, the sort of lateral growth. The other major distinction you'll see between monocots and dicots is that you will have this branching vein pattern, right? Monocot, it's all in a line. In a dicot, it'll start branching and almost looking sometimes even like I think of it as like this, right? Like the fingers on your hand, right? Where they all kind of come back together, and it's just how I think of it. So this is branching as well. Typically a lot of what we're growing really are the dicots. The major things for people that we also really do like to grow, we like to grow grasses, right? Human civilization is actually in a large part built on grasses, right? So whether we're thinking about oats, wheat, rice, barley, all of those things. So monocots have a huge place, but for a lot of the really tasty stuff, it's in the dicots. Flowers, I think this is really important. This is the other major innovation of the angiosperms, right? They're evolutionarily conserved. What do I mean by that? I mean that a flower is the part of the plant that typically an insect or an animal interacts with, right? So a little bee comes along, wants to pollinate a flower. If that flower is not, she wants to pollinate a flower, no, honesty. If that flower is not exactly what she expects it to be, she'll pass it over, right? She's like, I don't know what this is, I got a lot of work to do today, I'm gonna keep moving, right? So plants tend to keep their flowers the same over time. They tend to conserve the structure over time because they need to make sure that whoever it is they're trying to attract can recognize them. And so this is the really cool thing, is when people started first figuring out the relationships between plants, they did it by looking at the flowers. And so in the 17 and 1800s, they could just gather flowers from all these different plants, and by dissecting them and looking at them carefully, they could lay out the relationships of how they thought all the plants were related based on flower structure. And for the most part, they got it right. Right? Modern genomics, modern testing has corrected some of it or has added more information, but in general, like Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s, he was basically right, which is really, really cool, I think. It's pretty awesome. So the function is just reproduction and seed production. They don't care if they're pretty to you. It doesn't matter. It's just a nice side benefit. They can only be produced by mature plants, not juvenile plants. So this is the mark of maturity in a plant, or in a flowering plant. And for some of our plants, it can take many years to produce their first flower, right? So the peach tree might take years, even a hellebore might take years. So this is something that a lot of times, especially when you buy a flowering plant at a nursery, it can have been years for that plant to get there, which is kind of amazing. Within the flower, you have multiple different parts. You have, kind of the sepals here at the bottom, you have petals, and then you have the male and female portion. Charlotte always likes to say that she thinks that, ladies carry pistols, which is how she remembers the pistols. I just think she watches a bunch of Westerns. That's my theory on that one. So the female portion is the pistil, whereas the male is the stamen. They are made up of smaller portions, but importantly at the bottom of the female portion, you have the ovary, right? And that's where the seeds are formed. And often that is the tissue that enlarges and forms the fruit. This is kind of technical. It's fine if you don't remember it. It's just helpful to understand. We have complete flowers that have all the parts. And by all the parts, I mean they have sepals, petals, male and female. Incomplete flowers are missing one of those. Okay? So if you had a flower that was, for example, perfect, it would have both male and female parts, but if it was incomplete, maybe it doesn't have sepals, or maybe it doesn't have petals, right? So it's male and female, but it's missing sepals or petals. Imperfect means it's missing male or female. This is important to know. This is the real take home, I would say, is that there can be male and female flowers, and there can also be male and female plants. Okay? So squash is an example of where you have male and female flowers on the same plant. The way you can tell the difference on the squash is that this thickened thing right down here is the ovary. It looks like a stem, but it's thicker. That has to be a female because it's got an ovary. This stem right here is much thinner. That's a male squash flower. A squash will never form from that because it does not have the ovary. Squash will typically bloom first with male flowers early in the season, and then they will start producing both. If they are unhappy, they will only produce male. Okay? So if they're not getting what they need. This is important because every single summer, people will be like, I've got a bunch of squash blossoms and no squash. You're like, look at the stem. Look at the base of the stem. You know, we can try and figure out and think about the timing of this and try and figure out what's going on. Also, importantly, right, you can have male and female plants, right? So persimmon are male and female. Yopon holly are male and female, which means that if you want those great persimmons or if you want those beautiful berries on your shrub, you have to get the right one, right? Because if I get a male Yopon holly, I'll get flowers and no berries. Most plants, you have male and female together. But it's just worth knowing that there are cases where male and female have become separate. And so it's always helpful, especially if someone says, I'm not getting fruit, or the flowers are not producing fruit, it's one thing you might want to check, right? Like, is this plant one where that's just normal?
Ask me to proceed. So, for example, if you have a persimmon, one
Yeah.
is a male plant, one is a female plant, does only one plant produce fruit?
Only the female.
So you can figure out which one is.
Yeah, you can, but it's a bummer if you only have one plant, right?
Well,
Because
yeah.
then you're like,
yeah.
ah. You know, yeah, so exactly right though, exactly right.
So how do you tell the difference when you're buying a little one, you can't like look?
Check it out, yeah, no, it would be rude. So I think, so typically, folks will tell you, like a reputable nursery will know what their plants are and they'll be able to sell it because what they do is like ginkgo also has male and female and they just don't sell female ginkgos for the most part because their fruit smells like rot, which is just a choice they've made. So a reputable nursery should be able to sort that out for you, but it does mean that if you threw a bunch of pawpaw seeds out,
Yes, for example.
you'd just be waiting to see. Yeah, you'd be waiting to see.
Okay. Well, squash plants. Can you have a squash plant that's only male and one that's only female?
No, the plant itself has both.
It does.
Yes.
But then why the blooms can come but not the squash?
Because,
The fruit.
right, so a squash plant has male and female
Yeah.
flowers.
Yeah.
It has male flowers and female flowers.
Yeah.
A male flower,
Each plant will
Yes.
have male and female flowers.
yes,
Okay.
a male flower has no ovary,
Yeah,
so cannot produce the fruit. The fruit is of the ovary.
but if it's got the female, what's the deal?
The female flowers will produce the fruit. The male flowers will not produce the fruit. So the plant will produce probably half as much squash as you think based on the number of flowers.
I see.
Yeah.
So why does it have male flowers?
Oh man. We're getting into it. Oh yeah, that's even better. Okay, pollen. But also, the real reason is pollen, but the separation of why some plants have developed, plant sexual system evolution is actually crazy and really, really complicated because some plants develop to be asexual, some plants develop to pollinate themselves, some plants develop to refuse to pollinate themselves, some become male and female, some have male and female flowers. Ongoing research. Ongoing research. There's a lot of different ways that plants accomplish this. One more.
Does this occur naturally?
Yes.
Or is it because of what, intervention by humans?
No, I don't think humans would want these male flowers. You know what I mean? Because they're dead ends from our perspective. No, this is naturally occurring. One of my best friends in grad school, she did plant sexual evolution. It's wild stuff for certain people. Yeah.
So is this all squash?
Hmm.
All squash family?
I believe so. I don't like speaking in absolutes, but I would say the vast majority. I feel comfortable with that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So pollination. It's the transfer of pollen from stamen to the pistil, right? So from male to female portions. It's necessary for fruit, seed set, and development, and not all plants can self-fertilize or self-pollinate. That's an important thing to know too, right? So for example, a lot of times, tomatillo. Tomatillo, they will tell you to plant at least 2 tomatillos. Ideally, even different varieties. And that's because tomatillo can recognize self and doesn't want to self-fertilize. The reason for that is because when you mate or pollinate with someone else, your offspring are stronger because they're a mix of the 2 of you, right? And so if you think there are good odds that there's going to be another tomatillo around and you're a little tomatillo, you would rather mate with that one or pollinate with that one because your offspring will be stronger, right? It'll be better for them typically. Plants, where they don't expect to ever run into another one in their species, oftentimes will evolve to only self-pollinate, right? Because they don't expect to run into anybody else, and I don't care how much stronger that plant would have been. I need to produce something, right? Some of the major methods of pollination, we have wind. This is mostly, so you'll see this with flowers that have no petals. So grasses, many trees, actually including gymnosperms. You know how every spring our cars get coated in yellow? I mean, the world gets coated in yellow? That's wind pollination from all the pines around and from a lot of the other plants that are around, right? Even some of the oaks. Grasses actually have really beautiful flowers. They're just nothing like what we expect, and they're much, much smaller. If you ever want to see some really cool stuff that's pretty subtle but very pretty, just look into grass flowers because they're beautiful, but because they're wind pollinated, they're not showy and they're small. Yeah, muhly grass is a great one. So insects, this is when you'll typically see colorful flowers and fragrance. Fragrance doesn't always mean good, right? So things like the voodoo lily that smells like rot and stink, that's because it's pollinated by flies and beetles. So there's a whole class of plants that smell like rotten meat. And it's because beetles and flies really like rotten meat, right? And that's what they're pollinated by. And there are a bunch that are sweet because they're pollinated by nicer things, right? The other thing I will say too is that you can often tell what sort of animal or insect something is pollinated by the way the flower is shaped. So if the flower has a nice open platform, a lot of times that'll be a bee or something like it. Whereas if the flower is pulled back and tubular, a lot of times that'll be more like a hummingbird, something that has to come in. And plants will evolve to basically give whatever the platform is that their desired pollinator has. They will also evolve all sorts of signals that we can't see. So you might have seen this before, where this is geranium. This is what it looks like to us, right? Under UV light, lights up like a little landing pad, right? With all these little in marks and everything else like this. And so this is another fun one if you want to go home and look it up, is flowers under UV light, because insects can see in the UV spectrum, right? So the fact that it's these colors, probably just a byproduct of what it was trying to do in the UV spectrum so that the insects could see it properly. Insects can't see red light all that way though, so we have that on them. From flowers come the fruit and the seeds. These are the end results of flowers and successful pollination. This is important. Only the seed is the product of pollination. The fruit is the product of the mother. Why does that matter? Apples. Have you ever heard there's no point in planting a grocery store apple seed because it won't be like what you ate? Do you know why that? The reason why that is because of this. So if I go and I eat the most delicious apple in the whole wide world, and I take the seed and I plant it, it will not be that most delicious apple in the whole wide world I ate. And it's because the apple is the fruit, and that is the product of the mother. That is the product of that tree. The seed is the product of pollination, the mother and father together. So it'll be half like that tree and half like whatever the pollen was, right? So it'll be different. So this is why in a lot of cases apples are entirely grafted, right? They're entirely produced by cloning. They're not grown through seed at all because it doesn't make any sense, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get that mother grafted over and over and over again. You don't want to involve any other genetics that might mess up the taste of whatever that beautiful plant was, right? The fruit of a cross-pollinated plant will be the same as the parents. And the seedlings will be the offspring of the cross. And so what do I mean? So the fruit, again, is just the same as the parent, but the seedling is different, right? Does that make sense? Feeling okay? A little bit on the different types of dicot leaves, because again, we're working through some of those, right? Some of those cool things about angiosperms. Dicots are the ones where a lot of times you'll start seeing really crazy botanical nomenclature, and people will get really, really in the weeds, right? So they can be simple or compound, right? This is a simple leaf. They can be alternate, opposite, or whorled, right? So what does that mean? How they're arranged on those stems. So a simple leaf is just, here's the petiole, here's the base of the leaf, here's a leaf. A compound leaf, right, you would have this, and then you might have other little leaflets branching off. Alternate, right? Wait. Alternate, or wait. There we go. Okay, alternate. There, I got it, don't I? Okay. Opposite, right? Right across from each other. I don't have enough limbs for world. Okay. You'll get good at this, don't worry. It'll take time, but you'll get it. Simple and compound, this can be broken out further. Right, we have a nice little simple leaf, but compound can get pretty hairy pretty fast. And just remember that these are terms that typically we're talking about with dicots, right? They wouldn't apply to a lily leaf or to a moss, right? So compound, you can have things like pinnate, where you have this central portion and then you have the leaflets coming off. You can have bipinnate, where it's even further subdivided. This is all one leaf. This is all one leaf. This is one leaf. Okay?
And pinnate is also considered one leaf.
Yes.
Okay.
Each of these is an example of one leaf,
Yeah.
one compound leaf.
Right.
Okay, so I would count this the exact same way I would count this. Each of those are one. Okay?
And
I know.
that's determined because of the stem, or?
Yeah, so the way that you can tell is oftentimes, if you're unsure, look for the bud. Right? Because typically where a leaf connects to the stem, there's a bud at the very base. So this would connect onto a stem, and I'd see a bud. This would connect to a stem, and I'd see a bud. Right? So if I looked at the base right here, would I see a bud? No. Right? Here? Yes. Okay? This is going to be complicated, it's going to be hard for you. This is one of those things I would try to learn, but if I had to learn something, I would learn alternate, opposite, and whorled. That's way more diagnostic and way more important for what we're trying to do, especially because things like this, a hellebore leaf, for example, comes out of the ground. Where do I look for the bud on that? Right? Start like rooting around. You know, so I would say this is interesting to know just because it's interesting to know how all these different leaves can be arranged. And some people will want to know this, but for the vast majority of folks, alternate, opposite, and whorled. Okay? Okay, so boxwoods have opposite leaves. Which of these is a boxwood? All right, yeah, see this guy. See how these are, right? This one, there's one here, one here, one here. Right, we got this going on. So this is why a lot of times folks will bring in samples that are like one old leaf that like maybe their dog chewed. And you're like, that's great. I'm gonna need you to bring in more of a sample or to send pictures that show the entire thing, right? Just be aware of that. Don't feel put on the spot if someone brings a sample that's not big enough. You can always ask for more because it will allow you to do a better job, and that's actually what they care about, right? They're not trying to do some weird test for you where they like figure out if you know what this is or not. They're trying to get information, right? All right, so a little bit more on plant classification, but more from a gardener's perspective. And we are going to talk about scientific names a little bit because it's really important. Okay. Switching gears a tiny bit. Okay, so growth have a couple of major different types of growth cycle. We have annuals, right? Do everything in 1 year. They can be summer or warm season. Sometimes we also call them winter. So you'll have like summer or winter, you'll have warm or cool. Those are the same sort of idea, right? I like to think of those as basically whether they're on a calendar year or a school year. Biennial, 2 growing seasons. Perennial have 3+ growing seasons. Some things are very, very long-lived perennials, like trees. Some things are shorter-lived perennials where they only actually live for 3 to 5 years. The herbaceous perennials die back to roots each year, right? So this would be things like a lot of our flowers, right? Coneflower, black-eyed Susan, any of that kind of stuff, right? They die back every year right to the ground, right? A woody perennial would be most of our shrubs and trees, where even though the leaves drop off, the plant itself, right? A tree doesn't die back to the ground every year. For those where kind of a visual depiction helps, for an annual, a summer annual typically germinates summer right here, March or April, as things start warming up. They grow, they grow, they grow, and then they actually have basically a programmed death right around here when it gets really hot out. So a lot of annuals, even if you took them inside and you babied them and babied them, they actually don't want to go much longer. They have a programmed death where they're like, this is my life cycle, like this is what I do, right? They produce seed, and then the seed overwinters, and it's what starts the cycle right back over again, right? A note to that is a lot of what we call annuals here are actually tropical perennials. They just can't handle our cold, so they die. So there are some that you could take inside and they'd be fine, but a true annual has a 1-year life cycle. The winter annual, right, this is what I think of as more like a school year, right, where they get started in September or October. They just come up and they put out a bunch of little leaves. And those leaves hang out all winter until they get the signal that things are warming up, and then they send up a stalk real quick with a flower. It produces the seeds, and during the hottest months, it exists as seed, right?
Like poppies.
What?
Like poppies.
Yeah, and pansies, right? So these guys, they don't like the heat. So marigolds, zinnias, pansies, most of our vegetables, right, are annuals. Biennials, this is not actually terribly common, but it's basically, I like to think of it as like a souped up annual, right? It just takes 2 years to do it. So in the first year, it comes up from seed, March, April, and then it spends actually its whole first year building oftentimes what we call a rosette, which is a bunch of little leaves on the ground. It's really flat to the ground, right? You have the rosette, and then when it gets that second spring, it gets the signal that things are warming up. It sends up its flower stalk, seeds come out, right? And they hang out basically as seed for a couple of months, and then the cycle starts over. So, right, you go from rosette, low, flat, leafy greens, to flower spike, foxglove, right? A lot of times people think foxglove is a perennial because it reseeds itself so well that it always comes up in the same spot if it's happy, but it is actually more typically actually a biennial. So foxglove, mullein, honesty, not terribly common, but does happen in terms of biennials. And then we have perennials. These guys are doing kind of their own different special thing. So what they do is they'll come up early in the year and then just get bigger. And they can produce by seed. I love this diagram because it looks like there are floating plants involved, which I love. So they can produce by seed. They can also reproduce by cutting really, really well, right? Which is why especially it's frustrating when you have a perennial, something like ivy, and you try to cut it out, and you just cut it up, and then you actually have 1,000 ivy plants when you had one ivy plant, right? Because all of them become a new ivy plant, which is kind of awesome, right? Like none of us could do that. It's impressive, even though it's annoying. They'll also send off, right, these rhizomes and stolons, these modified stem structures. They'll do all these different ways of reproduction, and they'll just keep going, where they come up, flower, go dormant, and then the same plant comes up, flowers, goes dormant. And this is the other cool thing about this life cycle, right? Is that for very few things other than plants, do you go from immature to mature to immature to mature, right? You keep kind of going through this back and forth progression, which is really cool, right? Okay. Just a little bit on that so you know. Annual, biennial, perennial. Most of what we're going to be dealing with is annuals and perennials. All right, scientific names. Let's just do it real quick. Okay. Pro tip. Best way to say scientific names. Just commit to it. Okay? Nobody here speaks ancient Latin. It's just not a thing anymore. It's ancient. Current Latin, there are actually different conventions from country to country to country. If someone corrects you on it or you hear the right way, you can always change, but I wouldn't be sheepish about it. Okay, so we have Quercus alba. The second one is one that every time I see it, I kind of like gird myself a little bit, and I just do it, right? Lagerstromia indica. Say it to yourself a couple times. Just make it sure it sounds sciencey, right? It's fine. Echinacea purpurea. These are all things we can do. If you don't feel comfortable saying it, you can always spell it out. That's actually the true standardized way that we all share them. But don't get too shy about this. It's fine. Scientific names matter because both of these plants can be called vinca and periwinkle, right? If I ask you about vinca, you might tell me about either of those. If I ask you about periwinkle, you might tell me about either of those. They are totally different plants, right? So this one is a hardy evergreen ground cover, vinca minor. This one is a heat-tolerant, tender perennial, right? If I wanted a hardy evergreen ground cover and I got a tender plant that was just going to die basically in the winter, I would be very upset, right? The only way we can know the difference is by the scientific name. We need scientific names because common names are not reliable. Some plants don't have common names, or they share the same common name, and common names vary tremendously from place to place. Plant common names are a mess. Some of them are standard, some of them are not. I wouldn't rely on them. They are very, very, very helpful when talking to the public, because if someone from the public asks you about their vinca, and you look them in the eye and you're like, you mean vinca minor? Maybe helpful, maybe not the best way to start the interaction, right? Like I would fill that person out, okay? But for us, when we're talking about plants and when we want to make sure we're talking about the right thing, scientific names are useful. Also in different languages, scientific names are all the same, right? So it allows us to communicate across language, across region, make sure that we know we're talking about the exact same thing. The other thing that's really helpful about scientific names, if you ever want to trace them back a little bit further, is that they tell you the relationships. We typically talk about genus and species, right down here. But for any one of these plants, one of the easiest ways to do is look it up. Even on Wikipedia, we'll always show you the exact line. They'll tell you family, order, class, right? So I can know, okay, well, this is a black-eyed Susan. Well, it means it's in the Asteraceae. It's actually related, right, at this level, to all the other plants with this type of flower. And then I can find out, well, it's an angiosperm, because of other parts of its name. And so it can be really helpful when you're actually trying to learn a lot of plants and to learn how they're related to each other, which tells you a little bit about how they behave, what sort of care they want. This can be really helpful, right? This is what we talk about when we talk about a scaffold that you then hang information on, right? So just as you're kind of working through, it can be helpful to start thinking about this, but for the most part, we're going to be thinking at this genus species level. So what's in a name? So we're thinking about something like redbud, okay? So the species is the main taxonomic group for organisms. So for example, at the species level, right, we are sapien, right? We're Homo sapien, genus, species, we are sapien, right? So for a redbud, you have Canadensis and Cercis. Typically we'll think of both of these as being the species name, but so Cercis canadensis is our redbud, right? So that is one little thing to know, is that a lot of times we'll say genus, species, but if someone asks you the species name, they're asking for those two together, okay? The variety is the group within a species that has unique traits. So these are ones that would occur in nature and breed true. And by breed true, I mean that if you bred it to itself, it would produce plants like itself. Some plants don't do that. We'll get that to a sidebar, it's fine. So for example, you have, one is Cercis canadensis variety, or var, or biculata. That means variety. This is the western redbud. The reason we start caring as plant lovers about things like variety is because a lot of times we're not buying a straight species. We're not just buying a redbud. We want a redbud that looks a certain way, or does a certain thing. And those are varieties, right? You go to the garden center and you want a certain variety of whatever it is you want. A cultivar is a cultivated variety, right? Cultivar, cultivated variety. So this would be something like, let me get here, Cercis canadensis forest pansy. Have you guys seen these? These are these beautiful, beautiful red buds that put out dark purple flowers, or dark purple leaves. They're great, right? So you'll see that in these little notes. For the native plant people, this is an important distinction. A cultivar is a cultivated variety. A nativar is a native cultivar. What do I mean by that? Okay, Cercis canadensis is a native plant. It grows out in the wild, it's a native plant. Forest pansy does not grow out in the wild. Humans took in that native plant, we bred it for a while, and we got what we call a nativar, a native cultivated variety. And so its genetics are actually a little bit different than what occurs out in the wild. So a native plant purist would say, no, I want Cercis canadensis. Someone who likes native plants but really likes a purple leaf too would say, I want Cercis canadensis forest pansy. The true native for this region, which is a plant that lives or grows naturally in a particular region without direct or indirect human intervention, right? Something that just shows up, we didn't put it there, is Cercis canadensis variety canadensis. And the reason for that is because Cercis canadensis, this redbud, there are varieties of it that grow out in the west. There are varieties of it that grow all across the country. But the variety that has the genetics that have evolved in this place for these conditions is Cercis canadensis variety canadensis. So this is way more than most of you will really care about, but it's especially helpful when you're talking to native plant people or people who have questions about native plants, right? What is it that you want? Do you want a plant that evolved here and has naturally occurring populations? Do you want a plant that originally evolved here, but we took it and we zhuzhed it up a little bit, you know, so it's different, but it's got a zhuzh? Or do you want actually something entirely different, right? It's just helpful to know what they're asking.
What would be an example of an indirect intervention on a native plant?
So that would be
Yeah, direct and indirect.
yeah. So direct would be like, we brought it here, right? Indirect might be things like, we messed up the water cycle here so profoundly that the plant started changing. Or we added so much heat that the plant started changing. Or we didn't realize we were bringing it here, we really weren't trying to, and then it showed up, you know? That would be still a human indirect.
And when the indirect occurs, it still becomes, or then becomes classified as native.
So this is a plant that grows naturally in a particular region without direct or indirect intervention, right? So this would be something that was growing here. It depends on when you put your timeline, but people are typically looking for at least 500 to 1,000 years. Sometimes people look further back. So indirect intervention would be like, we were packaging a bunch of furniture and we packed it with a bunch of dead leaves, and we brought a new plant to a new region because we didn't realize what all was in the packing. That would be indirect, and wherever it showed up would not be considered a native occurrence.
Gotcha.
Because
It then becomes
invasive.
Well, it becomes introduced. It becomes introduced. Yeah. Invasive is like it was introduced and then it went nuts, right? There's kind of a two-parter there. Okay. All right. Let's get through this bit, then we'll have snacks, which is always good. Snacks. And we'll do our activities so that we can put some of this into practice, right?
Ashley, is this from the, I don't remember quite these pictures and things from the book. Is this
Yeah, mine will probably,
Any of this online?
this will all be put in the folder on the intranet that goes along with this talk, and I will, you guys, it's cool, don't worry.
Okay.
Alright. Photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration. This will be a masterclass in why did that plant fail. Okay? Why is this sometimes so hard? Okay, so when we think about all of plant physiology, actually what we're talking about is energy. And you can think about energy like money, right? Because you can do so many different things with money, but you can't do it all, right? So you can, if you have a bunch of money, you can spend it for immediate needs. You can save it for future needs. Invest it for future dividends, right? Maybe you get even more in the future. Or you can give it away, right? Those are some of the major things we can do. And we can do some combination of those things, but if we have $100, we cannot do $100 of each, right? We have to make choices about how we allocate. Plants are doing the exact same thing. So plants can spend it, right? This would be things like growth and defense, getting bigger, getting stronger, all of these things. Save it, putting some of that into roots, right? Putting some of it into these modified stems, like, or tubers, right? So saving it. Investing it, that's seeds for future generations, right? And you can give it away. Deer, bugs, slugs, gardeners, right? There's a lot of energy. The entire point of, for example, a vegetable plant from our perspective is to have a plant that produces so much it can just give it away to us, right? Tomatoes, corn, all these other things. We're just trying to take things from the plant. So how do plants make that energy? Plants use sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar, which is crazy. Carbon dioxide into sugars. This is photosynthesis. Just if there are any chemists in the room who like this kind of thing. This is what that looks like. You're taking carbon dioxide and water, and through energy from the sun, you're converting it to glucose and oxygen. Okay, so you're making sugars. Plants are the only thing in the terrestrial food chain that can do that. Okay? Everybody else has to steal someone else's sugars. Plants can make their own sugars. Plants use those sugars to build structures, survive, and reproduce. They use it for all of those things that they have to do, right? This is just fun. It's just a fun sidebar. Okay, so these single-celled organisms that gave rise to animals and to plants. That's one thing. There's, what you'll see here is another little thing, right, where plants are coming off bacteria. Does anyone know what that is? It's photosynthesis. Those are chloroplasts, right? These are bacteria that were absorbed by early plant cells that had the ability to photosynthesize. Those plant cells were able to absorb that bacteria and make it part of them. Make it a true kind of symbiosis where it always lives inside them. It has its own DNA. It's doing its own thing. It's really, really cool. This happened one other major time. Does anyone know what it was? It's an energy source that has its own DNA. Mitochondria, right?
What?
Mitochondria
Oh, yeah.
are little power sources. I always joked if I ever had to teach cell biology, it would just be me standing at the front of the room being like, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. And then I would just dismiss everyone. So this is mitochondria joining in. This is chloroplasts, photosynthesis joining in, which is really cool. Not all plants photosynthesize also. Good to know. This is a plant, Monotropa uniflora, which grows on beech roots. It basically is a parasite. It grows on those roots, comes up and blooms like this every once in a while. It grows in the forests even around here. It is white because it does not photosynthesize. It simply steals energy from the beech roots. So for photosynthesis, plants have to take in all this carbon dioxide. So they have stoma, plural is stomata. Most people will say stomata, which are tiny openings on the leaf surface. They're mostly found on the undersides of leaves, and they allow water, oxygen, and CO2 to pass in and out of the leaf. These little cells right here, this is actually a pair of two cells, are called guard cells, and they recognize or regulate the opening and closing. Opening and closes almost like a mouth. What that means, though, is that these have to be open for the plant to take in CO2. However, they also let out water. So if a plant starts getting too hot and too stressed, right, it wants to close them up so it stops losing water. When it closes them up to stop losing water, it also stops taking in CO2. Can't do photosynthesis, can't build those sugars, right? So they close to reduce transpiration, which is the loss of water. The reason why you would want to be losing water in the first place is the same reason we actually want to be losing water in the first place. It's like sweating, right? So what that plant's doing is it's moving water up through the roots, out through the leaves, and it's almost like sweating. So what happens is, as these little water molecules evaporate off the surface of the leaves, that actually uses a small amount of energy or heat right there, and it makes the environment ever so slightly cooler, ever so slightly more reasonable, and so it's cooling, okay? So they're always trying to kind of balance this perfectly. A large oak tree can transpire as many as 40,000 gallons per year. Sweat as many as 40,000 gallons per year. This is actually one of the major reasons we have an urban heat island effect, right, where cities are so much warmer, is because we have fewer plants. When the plants aren't sweating, all the heat hangs out, right? When a plant sweats, or when you or I sweat, that heat, that energy that we feel as heat, gets converted into the energy that changes it from water liquid to gas, and then we don't feel it like heat anymore because the energy was used up and it moves off. So when you remove the plants and when you remove the sweating, the whole area gets warmer because all that energy that would have been used for evaporation just hangs out and feels warm, right? So it's one of the reasons why adding vegetation to so many of our urban environments is one of the best things we can do to bring that temperature back down. Other factors that influence photosynthesis: sunlight, right? You're going to photosynthesize less on a cloudy day because that was your little energy cell for how you did that. Genetics. Different plants have actually evolved to photosynthesize in slightly different ways. If you imagine something like a lot of the cacti and the succulents, they live in such extremely hot environments that their stomata would always be closed. So they've actually figured out a way to flip their photosynthesis and their metabolism around. The optimum range really is somewhere in that 65 to 85 degree window, so temperature. And finally, water. Wilted plants do not photosynthesize, right? Because these plants have their stomata basically permanently, or at least for a while, closed. Right? A plant like this can't photosynthesize because the stomata are closed so tight to protect its water that it can't take in CO2. These are the ones that we really are bothered by in this area. When things get dry and when things get hot, the plants can't photosynthesize, they can't produce sugars, they can't produce energy. You know how in August you go out in the garden and it just looks like sad and tired? It's because it's been like dry and 90 for a while, right? So that's just kind of a natural biological thing that will happen in these hot, dry areas. So they're producing all of their energy through photosynthesis. Respiration is how they're actually using it to do all those things they want to accomplish. So those carbohydrates and those sugars that they made via photosynthesis are broken down, and they're needed for things like growth, defense, and reproduction, right? That's how they actually get that money in the bank account. This occurs in all cells. It uses oxygen, and it occurs in light and dark. And this is really the problem, actually, from a plant's perspective. You can only make money when it's light out. You're spending money all the time, right? So photosynthesis versus respiration. Photosynthesis makes energy, respiration uses energy. Occurs during the day only, respiration night and day. This is only in cells containing chlorophyll. Remember, so that beautiful variegated plant you just bought that's so beautiful but seems like it's having a hard time? It's because it has even less chlorophyll than you would have expected. This occurs in all cells. 75 to 85 degrees. Respiration increases with temperature. The hotter it gets, the faster respiration goes. Okay? So the hotter it gets, this shuts down, this goes faster. I think we're all understanding why the garden looks tired in August, right?
Really quick.
Yeah.
When I go out to my garden and it looks like that.
Yeah.
I just, it breaks my heart, I panic and don't know what to do. Should I put a little water on the soil, I leave it alone, what do I do?
Water can help, but right, water can't, it's gonna close
It's
those
the
stomata
temperature.
anyway, it's a temperature issue.
So just leave it?
No, I'd water. I mean, like, we're all going through something at that point, but don't feel, what you're doing then, at that point, I like to think of it as more like intensive care, as opposed to like a recovery, right? Where I'd be like, you're trying to get everybody through.
Okay.
Don't feel bad if they don't perk up right away, if it takes those temperatures coming down for them to really feel better.
Sprinkler from above or ground?
Ground's always better. So during our warm nights, respiration can approach the rate of photosynthesis, which means the plants can never make up, right? Because they're only making money during the day, but now they're spending it all day. The warm night, you want a night temperature that's 10 to 15 degrees cooler than a daytime temperature. And really importantly, some plants cannot grow here because they are not adapted to our climate, mostly for this warm night reason. So for example, if you were to look at USDA hardiness zones, our zone right here is actually very similar to what they are at like coastal central Oregon, where there are massive nurseries, there are massive sod farms. It is like a horticultural powerhouse out there. That's not, we don't have sod farms, not like that. And it's because their nights are cooler. Their nights are significantly cooler. And the USDA hardiness zone only cares about freezing temperatures. And so you'll see things that you're like, I should be able to grow this because they can grow it in Oregon. And I'd be like, you should, yeah, I don't know. Like, don't even try it, right? Like, it's not even worth attempting, right? And it's because of our warm nights. Our warm nights are killers.
Ashley.
Yeah.
When it says, warm nights respiration can approach rate of photosynthesis, mean it can balance it out, it can do what it needs to do, or what do you mean by approach?
So what I mean by that is that, so photosynthesis is going along during the day.
Yeah.
Respiration is also going along at the same rate during the day. At night, that rate for photosynthesis drops, right? Because there's no sun. Respiration keeps going at that same rate. So say that what you were able to do is you were able to make $1 during the day. You also spent that dollar during the day. And you spent another $1 at night. So you're going into a pretty hard deficit to the point where like this plant now can't build structures, can't defend itself, can't do anything that it really needs to do because its balancing is all off, right?
That's what it means by approach.
Mm-hmm.
Rate of, okay. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So when you say warm, are you talking about soil temperature, or are you talking about?
It's more up here because we're talking about a stomatal response.
Yeah.
Yeah, like where the leaves are. Great question. So what happens when you cannot produce enough energy? You have a cash flow problem. You can't spend, so there's going to be little to no new growth. You can't save, so there's going to be little to no saved energy either, right? So you might have a harder time next year because you weren't able to save any of that energy. You can't invest. So you have few or no seeds or fruits. So for example, tomatoes, we've all seen this when it starts getting warm out where they'll produce flowers, but they'll just drop off before anything ever even happens. Because over a certain temperature, they can't fertilize properly, they can't grow fruit properly, they can't do anything properly because the temperature is too high. This is actually a great strategy for the short term for the plant, right? Because if you have a bank balance of 0, you should not be trying to grow a fruit. From our perspective, that's really frustrating, right? Because I was like, you were only here to grow fruit. Yeah.
Does wind and breeze have any impact?
It can help, but again, wind actually also will carry off water more quickly. So even if those stomata were open, like if it cooled the temperature, then the evaporation would happen faster too. And so then you start kind of going sideways again. For plants where they form buds this year and use them next year, you can have fewer buds forming because they have no energy for that. So if you had a really hot, dry year, you might have a bad flower year the next year. Can't invest, right? So this is going to be things like defenses. This is why the plants look tired and then they start getting hit by every single thing, right? The fungus shows up, the insects show up, everybody shows up. It's because their defenses are down, right? It is so much easier for you or me to get a cold if we're tired and we're not taking care of ourselves. It's not because it like magically gives us a cold. It's just because the cold bugs that were landing on us the entire time all of a sudden are like, easy pickings, right? Same thing with plants.
So they have an immune system.
Absolutely they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got all the things. Although it's a little rough when it's like this. Stressed plants also will emit hormones and pheromones that insects have evolved to recognize. Right? So this little plant gets stressed and he's like, oh my god, I'm stressed. And the insects have evolved to be like, that guy looks stressed. You know, I'm going over there. And they can also often reproduce more quickly on stressed plants because again, they know the food is good and they boost up their own reproduction. Aphids will boost up their own reproduction because they know the eating's good. This is the one that often frustrates us, nothing to give away. So they will basically get to a point where there is no fruit, there is no extra for us, there might be no flowers, the leaves might look bad, all of it, right? Because they have nothing additional to produce into what we would want, especially from our vegetables. Again, like your question earlier, this can be especially bad when it's combined with drought. Because when it's hot and when it's dry, even if you were to have wind or even if you were to have anything else like that, it gets deserty almost for these plants, right? So in our area, some of the local climate challenges we have that really contribute to this, wind in the spring and the fall can actually make this harder because it carries off water more quickly than what is really ideal. Erratic winter temperatures, where we might get all of our chill hours that we need, and then it gets to 70, and then it freezes, right? And you just lost the peach crop because it flowered right when it was at 70. Drought, certainly. Our rain levels are actually fairly consistent with what they've been historically, but it's far droutier, right? So we get all of our water, and then we get no water, whereas it used to be far more consistent. Heat waves, certainly. Hot nights, this is our real killer. Hot nights are real killer. High humidity, when it's very, very humid out, right, sweating doesn't work as well. Because the air is already saturated with water, so it's not as good as taking it off, right? Think of plants sweating just the way you think of you sweating, right? The things that work well are great, and the things that don't work so well are frustrating. So, this is our last major one. So climate change in the southeast. Weather-related changes already exist and are expected to get worse in the next 30 years. One of the things that's a great example of this here is that it used to be said that in this area you could grow warm season or cool season grasses because we were right on the line. Neither of them grew particularly well, but you could grow both of them, right? Those maps even are outdated to the point where people really, really struggle with cool season grasses like fescue now, right? More and more of us are thinking like maybe zoysia, maybe those warm season grasses are the thing for me, or maybe just a bunch of native perennials is the thing for me because this grass never did well. And so that's climate change, right, that has happened even over the past 20 years. Our region is changing. I've seen models where over the next 50 to 100 years they expect us to be more like parts of southern Alabama, kind of near the coast. Higher temperatures. So the nighttime temperatures are already warming. We get hotter summers and more erratic winters. Overall precipitation might actually even increase, but it's going to be droutier, right? It's going to be way less predictable. It's going to be harder to deal with and harder to figure out. And so all of this will present problems for our plants, but it also means that we have a lot of opportunities to do things, right? Planting big trees, planting vegetation at all, helps our cities feel cooler. It helps all of us, right? And that's the cool thing about having a garden, is that what you do on your little plot can invite in insects, animals, it can help cool local temperatures, all of these things, right? These are things we can do together to contribute. which I actually think is kind of exciting. I always feel bad ending on the climate portion, but like these are things that we can change and we can impact even at the small scale. So with that, I'm going to actually say let's go to break, and I will stay here if you have questions. So we'll do a half-hour break, and then at 11 we'll meet back here for a minute, but we'll break out into groups pretty quickly, okay? Awesome. Oh, if you haven't taken your pictures, make sure you get your picture taken, and there's a seed swap.